As you know, we're reading in 2 Samuel chapter 19. 2 Samuel and chapter 19. Now we'll take the time to read most of the chapter together. So 2 Samuel 19, I'm reading at verse 1. And it was told Joab, Behold, the king weepeth and mourneth for Absalom. And the victory that day was turned into mourning unto all the people. For the people heard say that day how the king was grieved for his son. And the people gat them by stealth that day into the city, as people being ashamed steal away when they flee in battle. But the king covered his face, and the king cried with a loud voice, O my son Absalom, O Absalom, my son, my son. And Joab came into the house to the king and said, Thou hast shamed this day the faces of all thy servants, which this day have saved thy life, and the lives of thy sons, and of thy daughters, and the lives of thy wives, and the lives of thy concubines, in that thou lovest thine enemies, and hatest thy friends. For thou hast declared this day that thou regardest neither princes nor servants. For this day I perceive that if Absalom had lived, and all we had died this day, then it had pleased thee well. Now therefore arise, go forth, and speak comfortably unto thy servants. For I swear by the Lord, if thou go not forth, there will not tarry one with thee this night, and that will be worse unto thee than all the evil that befell thee from thy youth until now. Then the king arose and sat in the gate, and they told unto all the people, saying, Behold, the king doth sit in the gate. And all the people came before the king, for Israel had fled every man to his tent. And all the people were at strife throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, The king saved us out of the hand of our enemies, and he delivered us out of the hand of the Philistines. And now he is fled out of the land for Absalom. And Absalom, whom we anointed over us, is dead in battle. Now therefore, why speak ye not a word of bringing the king back? And David sent to Zadok and Abiathar the priests, saying, Speak unto the elders of Judah, saying, Why are ye the last to bring the king back to his house? Seeing the speech of all Israel is come to the king, even to his house. Ye are the last to bring back the king. Or rather, ye are my brethren, ye are my bones and my flesh. Wherefore then are ye the last to bring back the king? And say ye to Amasa, Art not thou of my bone and of my flesh? God do so to me, and more also, if thou be not captain of the host before me continually in the room of Joab. And he bowed the heart of all the men of Judah, even as the heart of one man, so that they sent this word unto the king, Return thou, and all thy servants. So the king returned and came to Jordan, and Judah came to Gilgal to go to meet the king, to conduct the king over Jordan. And Shimei, the son of Gera, a Benjaminite, which was of Bahurim, hasted and came down with the men of Judah to meet King David. And there were 1,000 men of Benjamin with him, and Ziba, the servant of the house of Saul, and his 15 sons, and his 20 servants with him, and they went over Jordan before the king. And they went over a ferry boat to carry over the king's household, and to do what he thought good. And Shimei, the son of Gera, fell down before the king, as he was come over Jordan, and said unto the king, Let not my lord impute iniquity unto me, neither do thou remember that which thy servant did perversely, the day that my lord the king went out of Jerusalem, that the king should take it to his heart. For thy servant doth know that I have sinned. Therefore, behold, I am come the first this day of all the house of Joseph, to go down to meet my lord the king. But Abishai the son of Zeruiah answered and said, Shall not Shimei be put to death for this, because he cursed the Lord's anointed? David said, What have I to do with you, ye sons of Zeruiah, that ye should this day be adversaries unto me? And shall there any man be put to death this day in Israel? For do not I know that I am this day king over Israel? Therefore the king said unto Shimei, Thou shalt not die. And the king sware unto him. And Mephibosheth the son of Saul came down to meet the king, and had neither dressed his feet, nor trimmed his beard, nor washed his clothes, from the day that the king departed until the day he came again in peace. And it came to pass, when he was come to Jerusalem to meet the king, that the king said unto him, Wherefore wentest not thou with me, Mephibosheth? And he answered, My lord, O king, my servant deceived me. For thy servant said, I will saddle me an ass, that I may ride thereon, and go to the king, because thy servant is lame. And he hath slandered thy servant unto my lord the king. But my lord the king is as an angel of God. Do therefore what is in thine eyes, but what is good in thine eyes. For all my father's house were but dead men before my lord the king. Yet didst thou set thy servant among them, that did eat at thine own table. What right therefore have I yet to cry any more unto the king? And the king said unto him, Why speakest thou any more of thy matters? I have said, Thou and Ziba divide the land. And Mephibosheth said unto the king, Yea, let him take all, for as much as my lord the king is come again in peace unto his own house. And Barzillai the Gileadite came down from Rogelim, and went over Jordan with the king to conduct him over Jordan. Now Barzillai was a very aged man, even 80 years old, and he had provided the king with sustenance while he lay at Mahanaim, for he was a very great man. And the king said unto Barzillai, Come thou over with me, and I will feed thee with me in Jerusalem. And Barzillai said unto the king, How long have I to live, that I should go up with the king unto Jerusalem? I am this day 80 years old, and can I discern between good and evil? Can thy servant taste what I eat, or what I drink? Can I hear any more the voice of singing men and singing women? Wherefore then should thy servant be yet a burden unto my lord the king? Thy servant will go a little way over Jordan with the king, and why should the king recompense me with such a reward? Let thy servant, I pray thee, turn back again, that I may die in mine own city, and be buried by the grave of my father and my mother. But behold, thy servant Chimham, let him go over with my lord the king, and do to him what shall seem good unto thee. And the king answered, Chimham shall go over with me, and I will do to him that which seem good unto thee. And whatsoever thou shalt require of me, that will I do for thee. And all the people went over Jordan. And when the king came over, the king kissed Barzillai and blessed him, and he returned unto his own place. And that will suffice, I think, for the reading of the scriptures this evening. Now, we do look to the Lord for some help, much help indeed, as we think of the quite complex matters that are brought before us in this chapter. Now, basically, as you can see, we have the aftermath of the rebellion by Absalom. And in verses 1 to 8, which we might call the rebuke of Joab, Joab, of course, speaks quite harshly to David, and we'll think about this passage in a few moments. So we have the rebuke of Joab in verses 1 to 8. And then I suppose from verses 9 down to verse 15, we might write the title over it, The Return of the King. You notice that is a repeated statement, bringing the king back. We have it a number of times in this section, and we have the return of the king. And then we have a lengthy section which we've read together from verse 16 all the way down, of course, to the end of our reading, where we have three men brought before us. Three men who meet David as he returns. We have Shimei, obviously, in verses 16 to verse 23, then Mephibosheth, verse 24 to 30, and Barzillai, verse 31 to 39. And here were men that had very different reasons for coming to see David. Now, of course, what has just taken place in Israel was a major crisis, a major disturbance in the life of the nation, the life of the people, and people reacted in different ways. Now, when we think of Shimei, he is a man who cursed David. We know that was the reason why he's here, because he realizes his life's in danger. He sought to exploit David's misfortune. And so that's the kind of man Shimei is. And then Mephibosheth, we notice that in this situation, in David's absence from Jerusalem, Mephibosheth mourns. That's really what lies behind verse 24. He never dressed his feet or trimmed his beard or washed his clothes. It was his mourning for David, and the fact that he wasn't with David. And that, of course, is the question that David raises with him immediately. Wherefore wentest not thou with me, Mephibosheth? And here is a man who feels it deeply, that he was deceived and he was slandered, and yet he was powerless, really, to change that. And then finally we have this lovely man, Barzillai, who's described wonderfully in verse 32. He was a very great man. And you might say, well, why does the Bible give him that wonderful designation, a very great man? And of course, what is evident is that he met David's needs materially. And we read about that at the end, and you've considered that, of course, in chapter 17. As David and his followers flee from Absalom, it's Barzillai, amongst others, who meets that need. And what we learn from that, and I think we can relate to it in some ways from our experience over the last few years, is that in every crisis, there are opportunities. And it is great men that rise to the challenge. You see, Barzillai wasn't regarded as great because of what he did when everything was peaceable and tranquil and everything was going well. He's marked out by what he did in the crisis, when things were going badly, when David needed loyalty, when David needed help. That's when Barzillai rises to prominence, and so it is. The real test for us is obviously in life's crises, whether that's individually or collectively as an assembly, or indeed what we've experienced as a nation. It's in those conditions where great men and great women emerge in those circumstances. Now, we didn't read the closing verses of the chapter, but we discover in this that there is disunity in Israel. And of course, the old fault lines reappear. You remember that David, of course, was king of Judah before he was king of Israel. And these fault lines, I've called them, these seeds of division, come to the surface again. And that's what happens when things are unsettled and things are shaken up. And the king has been deposed from the throne by Absalom for a period. And now that is evident, the men of Israel and the men of Judah and so forth. And really, it is the seeds of chapter 20. In chapter 20, there was a further rebellion by Sheba, and the seeds for it, the seed of it, is really found in verses 40 to the end of our chapter, to verse 43. Now, thinking about this chapter, I'm not sure I can quickly and easily define what I think are the practical areas of application for us, but I'm sure as we go through we'll say things that might resonate with some in the company, some more than others. But what seems to me is, I made the comment that this is a complex chapter. And it's complex because of the conflicting statements that people make. And nothing is just completely clear-cut in the way things work out in this chapter. For example, we have Shimei, who David promises he'll not take his life, but we know that ultimately he advises Solomon to do just that. Interestingly, David didn't forgive him. There is no statement from David of forgiveness, but he doesn't take his life, and we might inquire, and we will inquire as to why David didn't take the advice of Abishai and just put Shimei to death. And we're going to see that the way the passage is constructed and the context maybe just gives us a hint as to why David acted in this way. Now, with those rather maybe confusing comments, let's get down and look at the verses one by one. Now, the opening passage is remarkable in a number of ways. The first is that, as we considered our study last week, we saw David standing at the gate as his loyal followers went out to battle with Absalom. And yet, we learn in verses 1 to 3 that victory seemed or felt like a defeat. That's the irony of the whole thing. You notice that the language, the victory that day was turned into mourning unto all the people. For the people heard say that the king was grieved for his son. And the people gat them by stealth that day into the city, as people ashamed steal away when they flee from the battle. Now, these people had not fled from the battle. That they had been loyal to David, they had been energetic in pursuing Absalom and so forth, and yet they come back as if they'd lost. And this, of course, riles Joab. Now, and verse 4 tells us, the king covered his face, and the king cried with a loud voice, oh my son Absalom, Absalom, my son, my son. Now, what is behind all of this? And I think it illustrates a deep principle that is very difficult for us to deal with. And that is, David had more than one role in this situation. David was a father, but he was also a king. And in this particular situation, there is a tension between these two roles. There is a conflict between these two roles. You see, as a father, you would say it's absolutely fine for him to mourn for his son. That's evident. He would feel that. As he thinks of this boy that he had part of bringing into the world, and he'd seen the life of Absalom, a life that in many ways was wasted, and a life of failure. As a father, he grieved for that. And you say that's absolutely natural. That's what any father would do. But you see, David had another role. And what made it even more complicated, of course, for David was Absalom was the very reason was a rebellious son. He was the reason why David was deposed. And now he has loyal followers, and he has responsibilities for them as well. And what David is struggling with in this situation is how he kind of fills both of those roles at the same time. How can he be a father and how can he be king at the same time in this very difficult situation? Now, we don't gloat over this, and we don't criticize David, because we are well aware just how difficult these situations can be. But that's at the heart of what is brought before us in these opening verses of the chapter. It is the tension of trying to fulfill our obligations in more than one role at the same time in a crisis. Now, You say, are there any other examples in the Bible like this? Well, I think there are, of varying degrees. So, for example, if we go back to the opening chapters of 1 Samuel, Eli felt the same problem. Eli was the priest. He was responsible for the maintenance of standards in the nation, and yet he was also the father of two boys who were absolute rascals. And how do you play that? How do you work that? And actually, Eli failed. And of course, that was the substance of the first message that was given to Samuel. He had not received. He evidently failed in his duty of fulfilling these two roles simultaneously. Now you come into the New Testament, just to pick another, maybe less dramatic example. You think of the incident between Barnabas and John Mark. There was Barnabas, had a natural relationship with John Mark, but he was also a servant of God who was being used in conjunction with the Apostle Paul. And how do you tie up being a faithful servant when there is failure in a relative? And that brought conflict, that brought strife and division, and Paul and Barnabas went their separate ways. You think also of the situation that is described for us in the Epistle of Philemon, for example. You think of Philemon. He was a master and he was a brother in the assembly. So as a master, you can imagine he would be furious with Onesimus. Onesimus was his slave. But now Paul is writing and saying, well, actually, he's now your brother too. And so you see that we occupy in life different roles, some natural, some involved in spiritual activities, and sometimes there is a conflict. There is a tension between them because of situations that arise, and that's where David is in this particular chapter. Now, the language of verse 4 is really quite graphic, isn't it? The king covered his face. Now, if you cover your face, what you're trying to do is shut out everything outside. That's what you're trying to do. Quite literally, isn't it? If you just put something over your head, you can't see anything. You're unaware. You just want to be in your own world. David couldn't afford to do that. David was king. David had loyal followers. But David is just occupied with his own grief at this moment. And that's where the problem was going to arise. And the people who had put their lives on the line for him are feeling let down and ashamed because they've heard how the king has grieved for his son. We have this expression, don't we? Hiding your head in the sand. Putting your head in the sand. That's what David, he was just not aware. He was just not facing up to the whole matter of kingship that was crucial at this very moment. And so Joab comes in the forthright way which we would expect Joab to do. Now, there is a sense in which what Joab says was true. And David needed someone just to pull him back and to get him to take his responsibilities as king seriously again and get out of this state where he was only thinking about himself as a father. But Joab oversteps the mark. You can see that graphically in what he says. And so Joab comes into the house. Thou hast shamed this day the faces of thy servants, which this day have saved thy life and the lives of thy sons, and so on and so forth. And you say, well, Joab, you've got a point there. You've got a point. The people have almost slunk back to the city, ashamed, as if they had lost the battle instead of winning the battle. And Joab confronts David with this fact. But then Joab oversteps the mark, quite definitely. And the first statement, I think, is found in verse 6. In that thou lovest thine enemies and hatest thy friends. Well, first of all, David certainly loved Absalom, there's no doubt, but Joab uses the plural here. And there is no evidence that David hated his friends. That was just a misrepresentation of David. And you see, you could have said to Joab, you need to get David to think properly again. So we can commend Joab for sort of acting. But you see, Joab, just like some of us, he goes too far. He just takes it far too far. And we could argue that because of this, David dismisses him from his post. David didn't hate his friends. And his action was not of a man who was hating his friends. It was a man who had lost his son. And so Joab oversteps the mark. You know, sometimes we need to say difficult things. And we need to give a difficult message. But we need to be careful we do not overstep the mark. And we don't use language that misrepresents the situation and or overstates the situation. So verse 6 continues, "For thou hast declared this day that thou regardest neither princes nor servants." And then we have the distortion that Joab presents to the king. "For this day I perceive that if Absalom had lived and all we had died this day, then it would have pleased thee well." Now, nothing could have been further from the truth. That was a complete misrepresentation of David, and it was a malicious contention on the part of Joab. Now, we know he's trying to get through to David, but these words are a distortion, and they are evidently untrue. It was maliciousness on the part of Joab. Now, we need to be very careful that we don't just take things too far in seeking to correct a matter, that we actually start expressing statement or giving statements that are simply malicious and distortions and are not based in reality. There was no evidence for Joab to say that David hated his friends, or that he would have been pleased if they had all died and Absalom had lived. That was a complete distortion of the truth and demonstrates the lack of wisdom on the part of Joab. And verse 7 takes things even further. Basically, we have a threat from Joab. He says, "I swear by the Lord, if thou go not forth, there will not tarry one with thee this night, and that it will be worse unto thee than all the evil that befell thee from thy youth until now." Now, that's some statement, Joab. And if that is not a threat of desertion, I don't know what is. And how that was worse than, for example, what Absalom did, I'm not quite sure either. Yeah, that was treason. If everything was treasonable, that was a statement of treason. And Joab steps over the mark. You say he was right to go into the king. He was right to try and alert the king to the fact that the people, those who had been loyal to him, were distressed because of his reactions to what had happened. But Joab just takes things too far. And I think there's a lesson for all of us in that. Sometimes when somebody has done something wrong and we're seeking to correct them, we can just go too far. And Joab certainly goes too far. Now, the king doesn't say anything. There's no reference to what David says here. But the interesting thing in verse 8 is he does respond to Joab's statement, and he sits in the gate. He makes himself available to the people. He, if you like, he goes back to the situation at the beginning of chapter 18. You remember at chapter 18, David inspects the people who are with him, and he would go with them, and he's there when they go out to battle, and now he puts himself in the public eye again, so to speak, and the people can see him, the people can come to him, and they can see the king. So David responds to this, but he's not going to forget what Joab said. And neither should he. Joab acted reprehensibly on that occasion. There was a threat of desertion from Joab, which was just as much treason as that committed by Absalom, I suggest to you. Now, we're then taken into a wider sphere. And what we need to remember in all of this is that Israel has been unsettled by all of this. Now, when God's people, and we now apply this just in a general way, when God's people are unsettled, when there is either division or when there is trouble, things can go in all sorts of directions. And that's what this chapter shows us. Things can just go awry all over the place. And so we learn in verse 9 that there was strife throughout the tribes of Israel. And so on the one hand, they recognized what David had done for them, that he'd saved them out of the hand of their enemies. He delivered them out of the hand of the Philistines. But now he's fled. So they think about what has just taken place. And they recognize that they'd anointed Absalom, and now Absalom's dead. Now where does that leave you? They'd left David, and as it were, threw in their lot with Absalom, and now Absalom's dead. Now where do they go from there? So if the question is now, therefore, why speak ye not a word of bringing the king back? Now why was there that hesitation? For the simple reason that in going back to David, they admitted they were guilty in the first place. They shouldn't have abandoned David. But of course, there weren't many options for them. Would they want Joab as a king? Would they want someone else? No, David was the one to go back to. But it seems to me that the reason there is this strife is that in going back to David and bringing David back as king, there was an admission that they were wrong to do it. They were wrong to leave him in the first place. And we don't like admitting we're wrong. And there's this contention, this strife. So there's this unity in Israel. This is the situation. This is what 2 Samuel 19 is, the painting, if you like, that's being presented to us. It is a nation that's torn apart about this issue. There are those who are loyal to David. They think about what David has done. And there's those that had thrown their lot in with Absalom and they had made the wrong choice. And of course, Shimei was amongst them. And there's this whole question about bringing the king back. They would have to acknowledge that they had made a mistake. Now, David begins to take the initiative here. David's now getting out of that state of almost paralytic grief that he was in. And now David starts to take the initiative. And he starts with the elders of Judah. Now, you might think that was a sensible thing to do, but there was also a danger associated with that. And the danger becomes all too apparent at the end of the chapter. Because by, in effect, focusing first on his own tribe, his own family, if you like, he opened up divisions from the past. And the men of Israel feel hard done by, and they're aggrieved that they weren't included in bringing the king back. And in a sense, that all started when David challenges, through the priests, the leaders, the elders of Judah. And you notice the ground of appeal that David makes. Ye are my brethren, ye are my bones and my flesh. Wherefore are ye the last to bring the king back? So David makes an appeal on the ground of family. And that's a dangerous place to be. And it all begins to unravel at the end of the chapter again, and into the next chapter where we have the rebellion of Sheba. So those natural ties, which was a very natural thing for David to use in this particular instance, actually begins to divide the nation again. It wasn't just quite as good a strategy at the end of the chapter as it might have seemed in the middle of the chapter. And then he makes this extraordinary appointment of Amasa as the captain of the host, the chief of the army. Now, Amasa, what is bizarre in my view, looking at it, is that he overlooked the fact that Amasa had sided with Absalom. So Absalom had sacked Joab and placed Amasa as the head of the army. And David said, well, you just stay head of the army. And that was a strange decision. And it turns out, of course, in the next chapter, that Joab wasn't going to accept that without a fight, so to speak, that Amasa was not as efficient as Joab in military terms. Amasa just wasn't as good a general, if we could use those terms. He wasn't effective. And there's a lesson in that. If you have a role, you need to be effective in it. And Amasa wasn't, and that comes out in chapter number 20. But interestingly, verse 14, David still had power over the men of Judah. He bowed the heart of all the men of Judah. And you notice that he's got power over all of them. He didn't say he bowed the hearts of all the men of Judah. They had a collective heart, and David had power over it. He knew his constituency, you might say in modern terminology, and they welcome him back. And that brings us to these three incidents: Shimei, Mephibosheth, and Barzillai. Now, Shimei doesn't come himself, and maybe this is part of the explanation as to why David didn't go with Abishai's answer to it all. You see, David is concerned about the disunity of the nation. He's still, in a sense, in a very weak position. And you notice who comes with Shimei. Well, Ziba is there. That's an extraordinary one, isn't it? We'll maybe say a little bit about that later. But there's 1,000 men of Benjamin. Now, can you imagine what would happen, what those 1,000 men of Benjamin would think if David had killed Shimei? If David had agreed to Abishai's solution and exacted justice at that point? I suppose you could say David acted politically. This was a way of uniting. His gracious promise to Shimei might be seen as a device of bringing people together. He would not exact justice at this point. He wanted to get them together. And so there's this 1,000 people, the 1,000 men of Benjamin and the various servants and so on that come with Shimei. And Shimei makes his confession. I don't know how you regard this. I mean, Shimei is condemned by his own words, isn't he? He confesses that he acted perversely and he sinned. He's condemned by his own words. There is no statement that David forgave him. But he does promise he will not take his life. But he does advise Solomon to deal with the matter later. Maybe David just didn't feel that he was powerful enough at this point to do that. But anyway, David allows Shimei to live. Now, Shimei was not the kind of man you would want as a friend. He was a man that sought to take advantage of David's misfortune, to cast up old sores, things that had happened in the past. Shimei brings it all to the surface again. Now, we can be like that. We can just dredge up things that have happened in the past and just bring them to the surface. That's the kind of man Shimei was. He cursed David. He thought David was going to be brought down permanently, and of course, he recognizes the danger of his position, and we hear these words that he speaks. Now, we need to move on very quickly. We now come to Mephibosheth, and he mourned. He must have been quite a state when he appeared before David. He hadn't trimmed his beard, he hadn't dressed his feet, hadn't washed his clothes. You say, why did he not do any of these things? I think it's an evidence of his grief that David had been deposed. I think you can tell the difference in tone between Shimei and Mephibosheth. Different types of men. And Mephibosheth felt the fact that he'd been deceived. He'd been deceived and he'd been slandered before David. He would have loved to have been with David, but he recognizes he wasn't. I think there's a sense in which Mephibosheth is grieved about his own failure to be with David. He wanted to be with David. He was deceived by his servant, and his servant slandered him before David, and that grieved Mephibosheth. he just didn't rise. He just couldn't do what he wanted to do. And maybe you felt like that. Times there are things you wanted to do and you failed to do it. I think that's how Mephibosheth felt. Now, it's interesting that, of course, what belonged to Mephibosheth was given to Ziba. Now, David doesn't completely reverse that, interestingly, but they are to divide the land between them. Mephibosheth said, well, that doesn't really interest me. What I'm concerned about is that David is back in peace. He was a lover of David. I think that's the point. And that's what shines through in this. In a sense, he felt he'd let David down. He hadn't been with him. But his regard for David is undiminished. He hadn't cursed David. He regarded him still as an angel. He realized that if it wasn't for the grace that David had shown to him, the house of Saul would have been gone. And Mephibosheth is just grateful that the king is back. That's the kind of spirit the man had. We can capture that in spite of his own inadequacy and inability to be with David in person. Can we say he had a heart for David? That's the key thing. And that's what we need to cultivate, a heart. We can apply it to the true David, I suppose. To have a heart for him. And although we might fail him, as we do fail him, to have a real heart for the true David. I think you see that illustrated to a degree in Mephibosheth. But then there is Barzillai, and we'll just say one or two words about him. Very aged, very great. So there's something I hope to encourage those who would regard themselves as very aged. And maybe it is that the second term could be used of you as well, very great. But you see, you wouldn't have known it possibly unless there had been the catastrophe in Israel that had just taken place. Because it was in this catastrophe and in this crisis that Barzillai comes forward. He sees a need, and you get the detail of that at the end of chapter 17. David required sustenance, and here was a man that sustained the king and his followers and his household. He provided the king of sustenance, and that was his contribution. As I said before, one of the things I have learned from the COVID experience, I don't know what you've learned, is in a way that I maybe hadn't appreciated before, that in the crisis there is opportunity. There are always opportunities, different opportunities than those that present themselves under normal circumstances. And Barzillai saw that too. And Barzillai saw a need that he could meet. And he met that need. He rose to the challenge and he identifies himself with David in his rejection, and he provides for David and his household and his followers when they needed him. Absalom's rebellion was the occasion for Barzillai's greatness to be seen. And that is, I think, a great insight that we should be looking for. When things are not going well, it's the opportunity for great men and women to be seen. Not easy just to shrink away, but he doesn't. And now David recognizes and seeks to recompense Barzillai for what he fed David, and now the king says, "Come over with me. I will feed thee with me in Jerusalem." Now Barzillai declines the invitation, the offer, for the reasons that he describes and we've read. But the king recompensed him. And that's a simple lesson, isn't it? What we sacrifice for Christ, the true David, he will recompense. He is no man's debtor. Now, please don't think that means he's going to do it immediately, possibly. There will be recompense. Maybe not now, but there will be recompense. but we need to be prepared to meet the need as we see it in our day, whatever that day might be. And you can see the affection that David has for him. Verse 29, and when the king was come over, the king kissed Barzillai and blessed him, and he returned unto his own place. Here was a man that was loved by David, and who evidently loved David. And that's a wonderful thing, because we think, if we maybe apply the principle of it, there was an expression of David's affection and love for Barzillai, for what he had done and what he had sacrificed and what he had provided in a timely way when David was in rejection. Now the time has gone. In the closing verses of the chapter, we have again this disunity beginning to surface. The men of Israel, the men of Judah, the men of Judah speaking, and it says they were fiercer than the words. The words of the men of Judah were fiercer than the words of the men of Israel. And in the very next breath in chapter 20, there's a man called Sheba who's going to exploit that and who's going to utilize it in rebellion against David. Fierce words are very rarely helpful, and learning to speak in a measured way. Joab is an example of how not to speak. Speaking in a measured way is almost always important. Now, these are some of the simple lessons, and I'm sure there are far more details and lessons in this chapter than I can bring out to you, but I trust that it might be of some help as you move on into the next chapter next week. Shall we pray? Our God and Father, we thank thee for the opportunity of considering thy word. And we do believe that the things that were written aforetime were indeed written for our learning. And our Father, we think of this very troubled situation that we have read about in Israel, and how various men responded in different ways, some with virtue and others with foolishness. We do pray that as we consider these things, that we might learn from them, that we might be wise in our dealings one with the other. We think of this dear man Barzillai. We think of an aged man, and yet we think of a man who rose to the challenge and rose to the situation. And we thank thee for the greatness that he displayed in those days. We pray that we might learn lessons from this for ourselves in our own day. We do remember the assembly here. We thank thee for their testimony. We think of the issues that they face individually and collectively. We just pray thy blessing upon the company. Pray that they might know thy hand in blessing upon them. We think particularly of the gospel meetings planned shortly. We pray that thy hands might be upon this effort, and that thou wilt work, and that there might be blessing in salvation. So we just commend ourselves to thee as we part. We thank thee again for the privilege of gathering to pray and gathering around thy word, in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ.